She shouldn't have been standing there in the first place. Rain doesn't care who you are, but some people still act like it does. The bus stop on the corner of Maple Street in a quiet suburban district outside Atlanta was nearly empty that morning, just the steady hum of passing cars and the soft patter of drizzle hitting the metal roof above. Margaret Collins stood beneath it, 72 years old, holding on to the handle of a worn canvas tote bag with both hands as if it mattered more than anything else in the world. Her posture was slightly hunched, not from fear, but from years of carrying weight that no one else ever bothered to see. Her coat was simple, gray wool, carefully buttoned despite the humidity in the air, and her shoes were clean but old, the kind that had walked too many hospital corridors to ever look new again. She checked her wristwatch, a small silver piece with faint scratches on the glass, and whispered to herself, barely audible over the rain, he said 9:10, he should be here soon. Her eyes stayed locked down the road, past the intersection, past the traffic lights blinking yellow in the mist, as if she was waiting for something more than just transportation. That was when the patrol car rolled in. It slowed before stopping too close to the curb, tires cutting through shallow puddles with a sharp hiss. Officer Derek Hall stepped out first, his uniform crisp, his movements confident in the way of someone used to being obeyed without question. He scanned the area once, then his gaze landed on Margaret. There was no curiosity in his eyes, only assumption, as if her presence alone required correction. "Ma'am," he called out, voice firm but cold, "you're going to need to clear this area." Margaret didn't move immediately. She simply looked at him for a moment, calm and steady, then glanced back down the road again. "I'm waiting for someone," she said softly. Derek exhaled through his nose, already losing patience. "This isn't a waiting zone. Move along before I have to escalate this." A few seconds passed. The rain filled the silence between them, tapping against metal, concrete, and uniforms alike. Margaret slowly adjusted her grip on her bag. "He told me to be here at 9:10 sharp," she replied, her voice neither defensive nor fearful, just certain in a way that didn't match the situation unfolding around her. Derek gave a short, dismissive laugh. "Lady, I don't know who he is, but you're blocking public access. I suggest you turn around." Margaret finally looked directly at him then, not challenging, not pleading, just observing. "He doesn't like when people are late," she said quietly, almost to herself. Something in the tone made Derek pause for half a second, though he would never admit it. Still, authority filled the space quickly after. He stepped closer, enough that his shadow cut across the wet pavement in front of her. "Last warning," he said, sharper now. The air felt heavier, not from weather, but from the quiet tension of being misread in a place where no one bothered to look twice. Margaret didn't argue. She simply looked back at the road again, her expression unchanged, as if waiting for a moment she already knew was coming. Derek Hall stayed where he was, watching her as if patience itself was something he could enforce with presence alone. The rain continued to fall in a steady rhythm, softening the edges of the street, blurring the line between pavement and sky. Margaret Collins did not move from under the bus stop shelter. Her attention remained fixed down the road, eyes steady, hands still wrapped around her worn canvas bag. To anyone passing by, she looked like an ordinary elderly woman waiting for transportation, but there was a stillness in her that suggested she had been waiting far longer than the weather could explain. Derek shifted his stance slightly, glancing toward the empty sidewalk, then back at her. "Ma'am, I am going to ask you again," he said, his tone tightening, "this area is not for loitering." Margaret turned her head slowly, meeting his eyes again without hesitation. "I told you, I am waiting for someone," she repeated calmly. Her voice carried no irritation, only certainty. The kind of certainty that did not need validation from anyone else. Derek exhaled sharply, the sound blending with the rain hitting the hood of his patrol car. He checked his radio briefly, then returned his attention to her. "Waiting for someone is not a reason to block public access," he said. "If they are meeting you, they can find you somewhere else." Margaret's gaze drifted back to the road again, as if she had already stopped listening to the assumption in his words. He said this exact corner, she replied quietly. Derek frowned. Who exactly is he? For the first time, Margaret hesitated, not because she lacked an answer, but because she seemed to measure whether it was worth explaining. After a brief pause, she said, my son. The words did not carry pride or urgency, only simple truth. Derek tilted his head slightly, his skepticism unchanged. Your son is making you wait in the rain at a bus stop for a scheduled meeting, he asked, his tone implying disbelief rather than curiosity. Margaret adjusted her grip on the bag again, the motion small and deliberate. He asked me to be here at 9:10 in the morning, she said. He said he would come himself. Derek let out a short breath, half laugh, half disbelief. And you just stood here, he said. You did not think to go somewhere more appropriate? A cafe, a store, anywhere with shelter? Margaret looked at him again, her expression steady. He asked me to stand here, she said simply. The answer lingered in the air between them, not dramatic, not defensive, just final in a way that did not invite argument. Derek's expression hardened slightly. He glanced around again, noticing the empty street, the lack of anyone else nearby, the quiet suburban calm that made the situation feel even more unnecessary in his eyes. Ma'am, I am trying to be reasonable, he said. But you are making this more complicated than it needs to be. Margaret finally shifted her gaze fully to him, holding it for a moment longer than before. I am not making anything complicated, she said softly. I am only doing what I was told. A faint tension settled into the space between them, not loud enough for anyone else to notice, but present nonetheless. Derek's hand rested near his belt as if instinctively reminding himself of his authority, though nothing in Margaret's posture suggested resistance. She was still, composed, and waiting, as if the entire situation existed outside of her concern for approval or correction. The rain continued to fall, and the road remained empty, but Margaret did not look away. Derek Hall remained standing near the edge of the bus stop shelter, his presence steady but increasingly restless as the minutes stretched on. The rain had not changed in intensity, still falling in a soft gray curtain that blurred the outlines of the quiet street. Margaret Collins stood exactly where she had been, as if the ground beneath her feet had become the only place she was meant to occupy. Her eyes stayed fixed on the same direction down the road, unshaken, patient in a way that did not match the discomfort around her. Derek shifted his weight slightly and looked again at his watch, then toward the empty intersection. Ma'am, he said again, this time with a more controlled tone, you have been standing here for a while. I need to understand who you are waiting for and why this location specifically matters. Margaret did not immediately respond. She tightened her grip on the canvas bag, the fabric darkening slightly where rain had brushed against it earlier, then spoke with the same calm certainty as before. He told me this corner. 9:10 in the morning. He said I would not need to look for him. He would find me. Derek frowned, his skepticism deepening. And you believe that is a reasonable instruction? He asked. Margaret finally turned her body slightly toward him, not fully facing him, but enough that her voice carried with quiet firmness. I do not question him when he asks me to be somewhere, she said. The simplicity of her answer seemed to sit in the air longer than expected. Derek glanced down the street again, then back at her. You are saying your son arranged this meeting like this, in the middle of a rainy morning at a public bus stop, he said. That does not make sense. Margaret's expression did not change. It makes sense to him, she replied. A distant sound of tires on wet pavement briefly passed through the intersection, but no vehicle slowed or turned. The road remained empty again, stretching into the gray distance. Derek let out a controlled breath and stepped a little closer, lowering his voice slightly as if trying to reduce tension through proximity. Ma'am, I am going to be direct with you, he said. If someone gave you misleading instructions or if you are confused, I can help you find a safer and more appropriate place to wait. Margaret looked at him now, fully, her gaze steady but not confrontational. I am not confused, she said quietly. I remember everything clearly. Derek paused at that, studying her face for signs of uncertainty, but found none. Instead, there was only a composed stillness, the kind that suggested long experience with patience rather than fear. He glanced toward his patrol car, then back to the empty sidewalk, then to the sky where the rain continued its steady descent. Then at least step under more cover, he said. There is a convenience store 2 blocks down with seating inside. Margaret shook her head once, a small motion but final. I will stay here, she said. Derek's frustration surfaced briefly, though he kept his tone controlled. Ma'am, I cannot allow you to remain here indefinitely if it disrupts public safety or creates confusion for passing traffic, he said. Margaret adjusted her stance slightly, still calm, still unmoving in purpose. I am not disrupting anything, she said. I am waiting. The word hung between them, simple and immovable. Derek exhaled again, this time slower, his eyes scanning the quiet street once more. There was still no sign of anyone approaching, no indication that the situation would resolve itself in the way she seemed to expect. Yet Margaret continued to stand in place, looking down the road with unwavering attention, as if whatever was coming had already been decided long before the rain began. Derek Hall shifted his stance again, the tension in his shoulders becoming more noticeable as the quiet minutes continued to stretch across the rain-soaked bus stop. The gray sky above seemed unchanged, pressing down gently on the suburban street lined with trimmed hedges and closed storefronts. Margaret Collins remained in the same position, her presence steady and unshaken, as if time itself had slowed around her. Her eyes never left the road ahead, focused on a point in the distance that no one else could yet see. Derek glanced down the street once more, then back at her, his patience thinning but still controlled. Ma'am, he said, his voice firm but no longer sharp, I need to be honest with you. There is no indication that anyone is coming to meet you at this location. Margaret did not react immediately. She tightened her grip on her canvas bag, then spoke without turning her head. He will come, she said simply. Derek exhaled slowly, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. You have been standing here in the rain for nearly 30 minutes, he replied. At some point, we have to consider that there may have been a misunderstanding. Margaret finally looked at him again, her expression unchanged, her voice calm but certain. There was no misunderstanding, she said. He repeats instructions only once. I follow them exactly. Derek frowned slightly, studying her more closely now. Something about her certainty did not feel like confusion or denial. It felt practiced, grounded in something deeper than the current moment. He glanced at her watch again, noticing how carefully she checked it, as if timing mattered far more than comfort. If this is a family matter, he said more gently, there are services that can help you if you need assistance getting home. Margaret shook her head slowly. I am already where I am supposed to be, she replied. A faint sound of an approaching vehicle echoed from the far end of the street, different from the passing cars that had come before. Derek noticed it too and turned slightly toward the sound. A black SUV appeared through the light rain, moving slowly, deliberately, its headlights cutting through the gray atmosphere. It did not resemble a typical civilian vehicle in its posture or timing. It approached without hesitation and came to a smooth stop not far from the bus stop shelter. The engine idled quietly, almost controlled. Derek straightened instinctively, his attention shifting fully to the vehicle. The rear door remained closed for a moment longer than expected. Margaret did not move, but her gaze sharpened. Slightly, as if confirming something she already knew would happen. The front passenger door opened first. A man stepped out, tall and composed, wearing a dark jacket that blended with the rainy backdrop. His posture was disciplined, his movements precise, and there was a quiet authority in the way he observed the surroundings before taking another step forward. Derek's expression changed subtly as he watched the man assess the scene, his focus briefly locking onto the police officer before shifting toward the elderly woman under the shelter. The air between them felt different now, heavier with recognition that had not been present before. Margaret finally spoke again, her voice low but steady. "You are right on time," she said. The man gave a slight nod, not speaking immediately, as if confirming details only he understood. Derek looked between them, his earlier certainty beginning to shift into something less stable, though he remained composed. The rain continued to fall, but the moment had clearly changed, as if the quiet street had just acknowledged the arrival of something it had been waiting for without knowing it. The black SUV remained idling at the curb, its presence cutting through the quiet rhythm of the rainy suburban street like something that did not belong to the ordinary flow of the neighborhood. Derek Hall stood a few steps away from the bus stop shelter, his posture now noticeably more rigid as he observed the man who had stepped out. The stranger's movements were controlled, deliberate, and carried an unmistakable sense of training rather than casual arrival. Margaret Collins did not move from her position under the shelter. She simply watched, her expression unchanged, as if the arrival confirmed something she had already known long before the vehicle appeared. The man in the dark jacket took a few steps forward, stopping at a respectful distance from the shelter. His eyes briefly scanned the surroundings, then settled on Margaret. There was no urgency in his gaze, only recognition. Derek's hand hovered near his radio, not activating it, but instinctively prepared, as his attention shifted between the two figures. "Ma'am," Derek said. Carefully, his tone measured now, "Is this the person you were waiting for?" Margaret gave a small nod. "Yes," she replied simply. The man stepped closer, stopping just outside the shelter's edge where the rain still fell in a soft curtain. He looked at Margaret for a brief moment, then spoke with calm precision. "You were told to remain exactly here," he said. Margaret adjusted her grip on the canvas bag. "I followed the instructions," she answered. Derek frowned slightly, his confusion now more evident than before. The man turned his attention toward Derek, acknowledging him for the first time directly. His gaze was steady, not confrontational, but firm in a way that suggested authority without effort. "Officer Hall," he said, his tone even, "thank you for remaining present." Derek stiffened slightly at the direct address. "I was responding to a public concern," he replied cautiously. The man gave a slight nod, acknowledging the statement without dispute. "Understood," he said. Margaret remained still, her attention alternating subtly between both men, but she did not interrupt. The rain continued to fall around them, steady and uninterrupted, as if the world itself had slowed to observe the exchange. The man then turned slightly toward Margaret again. "Everything is proceeding as planned," he said. Margaret exhaled gently, a small release of tension that had not been visible until that moment. "He is late," she said softly. The man responded without hesitation. "Only by 2 minutes," he said. Derek's eyes narrowed slightly at that statement, his sense of the situation becoming increasingly uncertain. There was no hostility in the interaction, but there was structure, intention, and familiarity that did not match anything he had initially assumed. Margaret looked down the road once more, then back at the man. "You said he would come himself," she said. The man gave a brief nod. "He is on his way," he replied. As if in response, the distant sound of another vehicle approached, quieter at first but growing steadily closer. The atmosphere subtly shifted again, not through action, but through anticipation. Derek turned his head slightly toward the sound, noticing that this arrival felt different from the last. The man in the dark jacket remained composed, his attention now directed toward the approaching vehicle, while Margaret stood calmly beneath the shelter, waiting as she had been all along. The approaching vehicle slowed as it neared the bus stop, its headlights cutting through the thin rain like pale lines drawn across the gray morning. Derek Hall instinctively straightened his posture, his attention now fully divided between the first black SUV and the new arrival coming into view. The street, once empty and predictable, now felt compressed by presence, as if the space itself had narrowed around the gathering figures. Margaret Collins remained under the shelter, unchanged in stance, her eyes calmly following the movement of the road. The man in the dark jacket stepped slightly aside, allowing his gaze to track the second vehicle as it came to a smooth stop several yards behind the first. The engine shut off quietly, and for a moment, only the sound of rain filled the space again. Derek's expression tightened slightly as he observed the coordination between the two arrivals. There was no chaos, no urgency, only a structured sequence that suggested careful planning rather than coincidence. The rear door of the second vehicle opened. A second man stepped out, dressed similarly restrained in dark clothing, his presence calm but unmistakably aligned with the first. He paused briefly, scanning the environment before directing his attention toward the bus stop shelter. Margaret's gaze shifted toward him immediately, and for the first time, there was the faintest change in her expression, not surprise, but recognition deepened by familiarity. Derek noticed the shift and glanced between her and the arriving figure. "Ma'am," he said carefully, his voice lower now, "how many people are you expecting?" Margaret did not take her eyes off the new arrival. "Only those he sends," she replied. The second man approached slowly, stopping beside the first, exchanging a brief nod that carried no spoken explanation but clear understanding. The two men stood side by side for a moment, both focused on Margaret, their posture disciplined and composed. The first man finally spoke again, his tone measured. "We are on schedule," he said. The second man added quietly, "The final step is confirmed." Derek's confusion deepened, but he maintained professional restraint, his hand no longer near his radio, though his attention remained fully alert. "Can someone explain what is happening here?" he asked carefully. Neither man responded immediately. Instead, the first man turned slightly toward Margaret. "You will not need to wait much longer," he said. Margaret gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, as if accepting a statement that had already been expected. The rain continued its steady rhythm, softening the edges of the scene but not the tension that now filled it. The second man looked briefly toward Derek, acknowledging him for the first time. "Officer," he said respectfully, "your presence is appreciated, but no intervention is required." Derek's jaw tightened slightly at the wording, but he did not respond immediately. Margaret finally lowered her gaze to her watch again, checking the time with quiet precision. "He said 9:10, she repeated softly. The first man replied without hesitation. "He will arrive at 9:12. A faint shift passed through the group, subtle but noticeable, as if all participants were aligned to a schedule only they fully understood. Derek looked down the road one more time, then back at Margaret, who stood unwavering beneath the shelter, still waiting, as the quiet anticipation in the rain continued to build around them. The tension at the bus stop had shifted into something heavier, no longer just uncertainty but a quiet sense of inevitability, as if every second passing was aligning toward a moment already decided. The rain continued to fall in a steady, uninterrupted rhythm, forming small ripples across the pavement and soft reflections of the surrounding vehicles. Derek Hall stood slightly apart from the shelter now, his attention fully locked on the scene unfolding in front of him. The two men in dark clothing remained positioned near the curb, their posture unchanged, their focus steady and coordinated, while Margaret Collins continued to stand beneath the shelter as if nothing in the environment had the power to move her from where she was meant to be. The sound of another engine approached in the distance, but this one carried a different weight, slower and more deliberate, as if it had no intention of blending into the background. Both men immediately shifted their attention toward it. Derek noticed the change in their body language, subtle but precise, like a signal had been acknowledged without words. Margaret lifted her eyes from her watch and looked down the road once more. This time, she did not speak. The approaching vehicle came into view gradually, its dark frame moving through the rain with controlled precision before slowing to a complete stop directly in front of the group. For a moment, nothing happened. The silence stretched, broken only by the soft impact of rain against metal and pavement. Then the rear door opened. A man stepped out slowly, his presence immediately altering the atmosphere without a single word being spoken. He was calm, composed, and carried himself with a quiet authority that did not need introduction. Derek felt an immediate shift in the air around him, though he remained still, observing carefully. The two men already on site straightened slightly, their attention fully directed toward the newcomer. Margaret did not move, but her expression changed in a subtle, almost imperceptible way, as if a long-awaited confirmation had finally arrived. The man took a few steps forward, stopping just short of the shelter. His eyes met Margaret's, and for a brief moment everything else seemed to fade into the background. "You were told 9:12, he said calmly. Margaret nodded once. "I am here," she replied. The man's gaze remained steady, then shifted briefly toward the others before returning to her. "Everything is prepared," he said. Derek, unable to remain silent any longer, stepped forward slightly. "I need clarification on what this situation is," he said, his tone controlled but firm. The man turned his attention toward Derek without hesitation. "Officer Hall," he said evenly, "your role here is only observation unless otherwise requested." Derek's expression tightened slightly, but he did not interrupt further. Margaret finally lowered her gaze for a moment, adjusting her grip on her bag before speaking softly. "He said I would not need to explain anything," she said. The man nodded once. "You do not," he replied. A brief silence followed, one that felt different from the earlier pauses, heavier with resolution rather than uncertainty. The rain continued to fall, but the anticipation that had defined the morning began to settle into something more defined, as if the final piece of a sequence had finally arrived in place. Derek stood still, watching as the group remained aligned in quiet coordination, while Margaret remained exactly where she had been from the start, as though the entire morning had simply been a countdown to this moment. The rain had begun to soften into a lighter mist, but the atmosphere at the bus stop remained dense, as if the weather itself had stopped mattering the moment the final figure arrived. Derek Hall stood motionless now, no longer attempting to interpret the situation through procedure alone, but instead observing the unfolding interaction with a cautious awareness that something far beyond a routine encounter was taking place. Margaret Collins remained exactly where she had been from the beginning, her posture unchanged, her grip on the canvas bag steady, her eyes calm and fixed on the man who had just spoken. The man in question stood facing her, maintaining a respectful distance, his presence composed and deliberate. The others who had arrived earlier held their positions slightly behind him, forming a quiet, structured alignment that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. Derek noticed how none of them spoke unnecessarily, as if every word carried weight and timing mattered more than explanation. Margaret finally adjusted her stance slightly, shifting her feet just enough to steady herself, then spoke in a calm voice that cut through the quiet. "You said I would not need to explain anything," she said. The man nodded once. "That remains true," he replied. There was no urgency in his tone, only confirmation. Derek frowned slightly, his attention moving between them. Then, "What exactly is happening here?" he asked again, this time with more restraint than before. The man turned his head toward Derek, acknowledging him fully. "Nothing that requires intervention," he said evenly. "Only completion." Margaret lowered her gaze briefly, then looked back down the road for a final time as if confirming something internal rather than external. The road was now empty except for the fading rain and the distant sound of a passing vehicle that did not slow or stop. The moment felt suspended, as if the environment itself was waiting for a final signal. The man stepped slightly closer to Margaret, just enough to close the distance without breaking formality. "Everything you were asked to do this morning has been observed and confirmed," he said. Margaret gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Derek's expression tightened slightly at the wording, but he remained silent, absorbing rather than interrupting. The man continued, his voice steady. "You were not placed here by chance. You were placed here because timing was necessary." Margaret responded quietly, "I followed exactly what he said." "Yes," the man replied. "And that is why we are here now." A brief silence followed, heavier than the rain itself. The coordination between the individuals present now felt fully revealed, no longer ambiguous. Derek realized that what he had initially interpreted as an unusual gathering was instead a structured sequence of events he had not been informed about. The man then turned slightly, gesturing subtly toward the vehicles without pointing. "We will proceed now," he said. Margaret finally exhaled slowly, a controlled release of tension that had been held for hours. She adjusted her coat, lifted her chin slightly, and took a small step forward out from the shelter for the first time. Derek watched closely, his posture still professional but no longer confrontational. The others remained still, allowing the movement to happen without interruption. The moment felt complete in a way that did not require explanation. Margaret stood at the edge of the shelter, no longer waiting, as the quiet morning reached its final turning point. The final movement of the morning unfolded with a quiet precision that felt almost unreal compared to how it had begun. The rain had nearly faded into a soft mist now, drifting lightly across the suburban street as if the sky itself had grown tired of holding its weight. Margaret Collins stood just outside the bus stop shelter for the first time since everything began, her posture still steady, her expression calm, and her attention no longer searching the road ahead. The waiting had ended, not with noise or disruption, but with a quiet certainty that settled into the space around her like something long resolved. Derek Hall remained a few steps behind, no longer attempting to assert control over the situation, but instead observing with a measured silence. The man who had first arrived stood nearby, his presence unchanged, while the others maintained their positions in the background, forming a structured but non-intrusive perimeter. There was no urgency left in their movements, only completion. Margaret slowly turned her head toward the man who had spoken earlier. "So it is finished," she said quietly. The man nodded once. "Yes," he replied. Derek watched closely, still trying to reconcile the simplicity of the words with the complexity of everything he had witnessed. "I still do not fully understand what this was," he admitted carefully. The man turned slightly toward him, acknowledging the question without dismissing it. "You were not required to," he said. "Only to ensure safety during transition." Margaret adjusted her coat gently, her hand steady, her breathing even. For the first time since Derek had arrived, she looked less like someone waiting and more like someone who had arrived. The man stepped back slightly, creating space between them. "You followed instructions exactly as given," he said to Margaret. "That was the only requirement." Margaret gave a small nod. "He always said clarity matters more than explanation," she replied. The man's expression softened slightly at that, though his professionalism remained intact. Derek exhaled slowly, his gaze shifting between them. "Was any of this dangerous?" he asked. The man responded without hesitation. "No," he said. "It was controlled entirely." A brief silence followed, not uncomfortable, but final in tone. The vehicles remained idling quietly at the curb, their presence now feeling less like arrival and more like readiness for departure. Margaret looked down the road one final time, then back toward the man. "He will not be late again," she said softly. "He was not late," the man corrected gently. "He arrived exactly when required." Derek noticed the way Margaret accepted that statement without question, as if timing carried a meaning beyond simple measurement. The group began to shift subtly, not dispersing, but transitioning. The structure that had formed around the bus stop began to loosen in a coordinated way, as if the purpose of the gathering had been fulfilled. Margaret took one small step forward, then another, leaving the exact position where she had stood for so long. Derek remained still, watching as she moved past the edge of the shelter, no longer waiting for anything at all. The morning felt different now, not because something dramatic had happened, but because everything that needed to happen had already been completed. The rain finally stopped completely, leaving only the quiet reflection of the street behind as the last figures prepared to leave, and Margaret Collins walked forward with steady calm into the next part of her day.